Hello, it's Shelley F Knight, bringing you Positive Changes, a self-kick podcast. So today on the show, we're joined by Leah M. Forney, and she's author of Defining Moments and podcast host of Hey Queen Thrive. So hello to Leah.
Hi.
Hello. I'm loving the sassy name of the podcast.
I tell you, I was like trying to figure out a podcast name for so long, and then who knew all I had to do was take a nap, and then voila, it would come to me in a dream. And so that's how Hey Queen Thrive came about.
I love it. It is sassy. Absolutely love it. So bless you. I know you've got quite a backstory, so please do share your story about positive changes.
Yeah, so I am originally from Queens, New York, born and raised by my maternal grandmother because my parents both were drug addicts. My mom was a drug addict, my dad was a drug addict and an alcoholic. So my mom actually had 6 children and she gave them all up. And so
Wow.
my grandmother, she raised myself, my older brother, and my youngest sister, and then the other 3 were actually adopted by a different family. So you can only imagine, growing up and knowing that you are different and feeling different because you're looking at like your friends in the neighborhood and they have both parents and you don't have both parents, and just the things you feel like you missed out. Like I always think back and I think about how I didn't get to go to daddy daughter dances and things like that because my parents weren't around. But I actually didn't find out about their addiction until I was a teenager. So my grandmother kind of hid it from me for a long time. Because, and I get it now, because back then it was like, well, why wouldn't you tell me? But it was more of her protecting us. So she just waited till we were about 17 years old to finally just come out and say this was what was going on. But I always knew because we would go to like, the doctor, for instance, and I'm getting a checkup, and they would always ask about my mother and father, and she would always say, oh, we have to talk about that in private. So I kind of knew something. I just didn't know what it was. So yeah, growing up, it was just difficult. Like I had anger issues as a kid, because I just couldn't make sense of why I didn't have my parents. But then I struggled emotionally a lot because I felt like I wasn't good enough, and I questioned that. I questioned, like, was I not good enough for my parents? Why my parents didn't want me? Which eventually, as an adult, those same feelings manifested, and then it made it difficult to trust. It made it difficult to be vulnerable with people because um, I just didn't trust people because I didn't have my parents. So fast forward into uh, my 20s, if you will, I started writing. But I've always been a writer. So as a kid, my grandma used to tell me I used to pen poems and letters to Santa and Jesus. That's what she used to tell me. She was like, you always was writing. And I felt that writing was an escape for me. It was an escape. It was therapeutic for me. So I would just write little things. I would just write like poems, quotes, short stories, things like that. And then around 2017, 2016 to 2017, I decided I'm going to write a book. And that's where I wrote my very first book, Unapologetically Me, which is actually the story of what it was like growing up without my mother and father and just some of the struggles that I had. And so that was like the beginning of using writing to kind of talk about my pain, because for a while I stayed out of, like, I eventually went to therapy, but for a while it was like I didn't know I wanted to go to therapy, so I just wrote, and writing was just the thing that kind of got it out. But never did I think, okay, I'm gonna get it out and turn this into a book. Like I didn't see that. But my friends used to always tell me, you're a great storyteller. You should tell it. Like, you should really tell your story. And then I learned the power in really telling your story and really being um, unapologetic about who you are and where you come from.
I absolutely love that. I was just thinking back. I know we can't go back on our past and change it. But I was thinking, bless your grandmother, you know, sort of like protecting you for 17 years.
Yeah.
I have to ask the question, if she'd have told you the truth about your parents from the start, would that have helped you, do you think?
You know what? I don't know, because even now as an adult, and my father has passed, but I think I've always just saw my parents as like a hero to me. It's the weirdest thing. Like this can, and I guess because those are my parents. So I never, even knowing all that they've done and the pain that they caused, it's hard to look at them at anything less than like that's mom and dad. So I don't know if it would have, I don't think if it would have changed anything. And it's weird because growing up in New York, I never saw my parents under the influence of drugs or alcohol. So it's like I got the protection both ways because I got it from my grandmother, but then spiritually, I felt like, you know, God was protecting me. I mean, my parents and I were in the same city, and
Yeah.
we never crossed paths. I never saw what it was like to see my mom under the influence of drugs or my dad under the influence of drugs. So even hearing that this was their issue, it was kind of like hard because I'm like, I've never seen them like that. But then I also never really saw them because my dad, he was always in and out of prison. And the few times he came around, like he was sober. So it was hard to even think that he had an issue.
Yeah. I think that's really beautiful. The fact you said that they're kind of like your heroes. And I think that is part of it, isn't it? We have this unconditional love for our parents.
Yeah.
I mean, like I was raised by my parents and they divorced, but you know, I don't know what it is. It must be this unconditional love where you can't really think of a bad thing to say. It just is what it is almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
So you had a really, I think it's beautiful, like positive kind of take on it. What about your siblings? How did they process it?
No, I probably am the more optimistic one than my siblings. They all still to this day struggle with who our parents are and were, and kind of that lifestyle that they chose to live. My older brother, he's very nonchalant about it. He kind of just acts like it doesn't exist. I think it affected my sisters and I the more, especially with our father, because I just believe that daddy is your first love, right? Like you kind
Yeah.
of learn what a man looks like and what type of man you should want from dad. And so just not having that, I think it impacted us more than it impacted my brothers because we had to kind of discover what kind of man we should be dating and in relationships with kind of on our own through trial and error. Whereas I think if we had dad there to really like validate us and remind us how beautiful we were and how worthy we were, we probably would have chose different men for our lives at that time. For my brothers, I think that they both just act like it doesn't affect them, but I think deep down inside it does because again I think your father is so crucial for both men and women because who teaches the boy how to be a man if he doesn't have his dad in his life. But I think my brothers struggle more with our mom not being around than our dad not being around.
Yeah. I love that. Thank you for explaining. Now, your book's called Unapologetically Me, which I
Mm-hmm.
love.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a sense of who you were? I know you're saying like you're not apologizing for who you are, but did you, with your parents not being around, did you understand who you were? Or do you have like a loss of identity around that?
I definitely in the beginning had a loss of identity. I spent like probably my 20s really trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted out of my life. I named it Unapologetically Me because it was me really saying that I'm not going to be ashamed about where I come from. I'm not going to be ashamed about having two parents who are addicts. I'm not going to be ashamed about it because when I was a kid, I was like people would ask me about who my parents were, and I would lie about it. Oh, my daddy's a chef. My mom does this. Like I would just lie about it because I wanted to fit in. But as I got older, it was like I'm not going to be ashamed about it. Like this is where I come from, and to be honest, I have learned since writing that book how much my story is like so many others. And so many other people have come out and said, you know what, thank you for saying that you're unapologetic about who you are and what you come from, because now I can be the same way. And that was really the reason why I named it that, because I'm like, you know what, I've just been walking around with all this shame and feelings of like, oh, I gotta hide what makes me me, and I'm not gonna do that anymore.
I absolutely love that, because I think it is so easy to define ourselves, isn't it? Or to sort of say like, I am this way because of my parents, but you're really beautiful, that you're not ashamed of yourself, not ashamed of them. And I think that's beautiful about everyone's life story involved. I truly do.
Yeah.
So you went along for the 17 years, and then sort of like grandma said, like, actually, this is the truth. And then the 20s, you started sort of like, I don't know, unpackaging it all and things like that. So was this part of the positive change where you've gone from like growing up with this anger and this sort of loss of identity into actually, this is who I am? Was this the positive change?
Yeah, I think that, so I think the shift began definitely in my early 20s, where once I went to my grandmother and we had the conversation and she shared with me this is who my parents were. At the time, my father's side of the family wasn't even in my life yet. And I remember having that conversation with my grandmother, and I was like, Grandma, listen, I really need to know where I come from. Like, I need to know this other side of my family. And she was hesitant, because she's like, I don't know. It was kind of like opening Pandora's box. You just didn't know what you were going to get. But she gave me her blessing, and she said, okay, if you really feel like you need to do this, then I'm going to support you in it. So, probably in my early 20s, I connected with my father's side of the family. I met my father's mom for the first time. And, just being able to see where some of my characteristics came from, because, as kids, you have these personalities and you're like, where does this come from? Like, why, where does these little quirks and kinks come from? So I got around my father's side of the family. I met my aunts, I met cousins. I got to see all these pictures, hear all these stories. And I started to put the pieces of the puzzle together. And it was like, okay, this makes sense why I have this part of my personality. This makes sense. So that was kind of the beginning of the positive change, because prior to that, I felt like I wasn't whole. Like, I felt like there was just pieces of the puzzle and there were missing pieces. And so I went on this journey in my early 20s of really figuring out, who is Leah M. Forney? Where does she come from? What is her background like? You know, who is her father? Who is her mother? And really doing a lot of soul searching and just research and just connecting. So that was the beginning of the positive change for me, because now when I wrote the book, it was like, yeah, I am unapologetically me. I am. Like, this is who I am. I come from a father who has Southern roots. My mom has, like, I knew these things, whereas prior to, I didn't.
I think your message today is going to help so many people, because I think there's so many people who've grown up with sort of like absent parents or absent carers and things like that, or even not even grown up at parts in their life their parents have been absent. And
Yeah.
it's brilliant that you've said, like, you have these light bulb moments where you think, now I get that bit of personality. Because I think we do think, I don't know who I am, part of me is missing, part of my understanding is missing.
Yeah.
And with that, we can get angry and frustrated, or think we're not good enough because we don't really know who we are to be enough and things like that. So I think your message is really going to help. What I would love to ask is, what tools did you use to go on this soul searching journey towards positive change?
Yeah. So I mean, I'm a spiritual person. I grew up in the church. My grandmother raised me in the church. So I definitely relied on my faith in God for sure. Um, but then the other thing is just having that support system. I honestly think if my grandmother did not support me in this journey, it would have been really difficult. I probably would have done it anyway, because a part of my personality is to be a little rebellious. I probably would have done it anyway, but just having that support, knowing that she was going to be there, whether, it worked out or didn't work out, like, she was going to be there, was definitely helpful. Um, of course, emotionally, I definitely journaled, because you can imagine I'm meeting my father's side of the family for the first time, and all these stories and all this information is coming at me, and just needing to process that emotionally. I definitely journal. I still journal. But then I also started therapy as well, just to have that emotional outlet, to really just unpack this thing and really figure out, what parts of it is worth, keeping, and what parts of it I'm like, I don't want to deal with that. So all of those things combined and still do like continues to help me on this journey towards positivity and continuing to change.
That's fabulous. What I really loved, I don't know why, things just resonate with you in life when you're like looking back, you've learned all these stories from your dad's side, and then you just think, what's worth keeping?
Yeah.
And I love that, because we hold on to so much, don't we? Sort of our story,
Yeah.
other people's story, our memories, or how we think things are. But I love that, like what's worth keeping. And I think that's gorgeous.
Yeah, because I mean, my dad struggled with addiction. So, of course, you hear the stories of, oh, your father was an addict and he was in prison and all. You hear the negative narrative, right? But I'm like, underneath all that, who was he? So then to hear that, like, his passion was to cook and he wanted to be a chef. And those were the parts of the story that I wanted to keep. And again, that goes back to why my parents are heroes to me, because it's easy to harp on the negative narrative, right? It's easy to harp on what they are not good at or what they don't do or what. It's the hardest thing is to hold on to the parts of them that are good. And that's probably why I've always had that thought process, because I'm like, I can always be like everybody else and think of them in a very negative light, or I can change the narrative and hold on to the parts of them that make them good people despite their flaws.
I just think it's really beautiful. I truly do. And it sounds like, I'm sure it didn't, but it sounds like it just flowed. Like you just sort of like, at 17, your grandma was really honest about you. And then you went down like, the writing and the journaling, the talking therapy. So it sounds like it just flowed, but I'm sure it didn't, because it's always easy to tell the story towards the end of the outcome.
Yeah.
But was there forgiveness or anything that was needed from the past? Or is it, it is what it is?
Yeah, I had to come to the place where I had to forgive my parents. And there was actually a time, I want to say maybe I was about 27 years old, where so both my parents happened to be in the same state. I was living in North Carolina at the time. Both of them had wound up moving down there to leave New York to try to really do this recovery and sobriety thing. And just being able to have that conversation in that time and really tell my dad, how his absence impacted my life. And to really tell my mom, how her not being there to kind of help me through those womanhood issues impacted my life was definitely a powerful moment for both of us, because in those moments, I got to hear their heart and I got to hear how they ended up in their own struggle. I remember asking both of them, like, why? Like, how did you get here? And then hearing my mom's story and her sharing, being molested as a young girl. And that's kind of how she ended up doing drugs to kind of escape the pain. And my dad, sharing, hearing that he was a fatherless child because his dad was murdered, and how drinking, at a young age was his way of dealing with the pain. So just finally getting that answer, because I think for children who grow up without their parents, there's always that question of why.
Yeah.
So it took 20 something years, but I finally got the answer, which made it so much easier to let them off the hook, because now I had the answer to why, and I was able to free myself and finally say, this had nothing to do with me. So for 20 some years, I was living thinking that my parents' addiction was because of me, because and that was the narrative I told myself, that, oh, I'm not good enough and that's why they left. And they, and then finally hearing it from them, what led to their addiction, was so freeing for me, because then it was like, no, this doesn't have anything to do with me. This is, their trauma and their issues, and that's how they decided to deal with it. And so in those moments, I was finally able to say, you know what, mom, you know what, dad, I forgive you. And really, I learned then that they loved me so much that they gave me up. And I learned that that was the hardest thing that they could do. And it took 20 some years to get there, but that was the moment that everything changed for me, because it was like, wow, that's, to me, that was the ultimate sacrifice of love. I love you enough to say, I can't do this, so I'm going to put you in the hands of someone who can.
That's beyond beautiful. I'm almost speechless, which is amazing, Leah, because I'm quite gobby normally. It's just, wow. I think it's really courageous that you even ask those questions to your parents,
Yeah.
to actually say sort of like, what was the trigger behind your addiction behavior? And I love the fact you had the courage to ask that, because otherwise you could still be living that narrative like, I'm not good enough, they did drugs because of me, my siblings, whatever. But you found the courage somewhere within your beautiful body to ask them, like, why?
Yeah.
And their reasons are so valid. Like, your mum
Yeah.
was molested, your dad was fatherless due to, a murder. They're like major, major, major
Yeah.
things, which has got nothing to do with the narrative you was telling yourself. So to find the courage is life-changing for you, your parents, and hopefully your siblings, and anyone listening today. It's just amazing.
Yeah. It was the moment I realized that my parents were human, and they were human
Oh,
with human emotions that went through human, uh, you know, situations that led them down this path. I think a lot of times we forget that our parents they are human, and they have a backstory, and they have some things that have happened, and that's why they are who they are. So finally, just that was the moment where I'm like, you know what? I've been putting them on this pedestal like they're this superhero when they're just human.
yeah, I think it's absolutely amazing. I'm thinking like people listening today that have been, adopted or fostered or, given their own children away because of, they, as you said so beautifully, I won't do it half as eloquently as you did, Leah, but that because of pure love, because of duty to give you the best life, the best chance, out of pure love, that's why it happened. And I
Yeah.
just think that's an amazing message to share out there today.
Yeah.
I can see why your book's called Unapologetically Me, because you've got absolutely nothing to apologize for. It's absolutely amazing, your story.
Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely amazing. I just find you so inspirational. I just think it's gorgeous. You're gorgeous. And
Thank
whilst it's a
you.
like, really traumatic story along the way, so many
Mhm.
lost years, so many lost conversations, things like that, I think it's absolutely the most beautiful story I've heard in a long time.
Thank you.
So bless you. So you wrote, as part of your tools for healing, you've got Unapologetically Me, but there's another book you're still writing, you're still doing this therapy, this healing and helpers. So tell us about the next one, Defining Moments.
Yeah, so Defining Moments is actually probably the most difficult book to write. So I'm a nonfiction writer, so all my books are pulled from definitely true events, parts of my story. Defining Moments, I started writing that book maybe 6 months to a year after I buried my fiance. And so he died unexpectedly the day after Mother's Day in 2018. Um, and so it's weird because when I usually pray when I'm getting ready to write a book. And in my prayer time, that was like what was revealed to me, that I needed to share my story with grief. But it was hard because I was still grieving. So it was like, oh, you want me to put on paper this whole story while still living it. But I needed to do it because I needed to show a process. I needed my readers to see kind of how grief works. And I did that because I think a lot of times we don't know how to really help people or handle people while they're grieving. We say very, cliche things like, oh, God needed them more than they did, or stuff like that just doesn't make sense. And so with this book, I wanted to detail my journey with grief, but I really wanted to show people the ups and downs, the emotions, the ins and outs of how people grieve. I'm a fan of the stages of grief, but what I always share with people is that healing is not linear. It's not like you go from one stage to another stage to another stage to another. It's all over the place. Like there's moments where you're like, you've been in denial, and then all of a sudden acceptance show up. Like there's these different ways of how it comes. But then I also wanted to show people that grief comes in waves. it's not that people are, you know, up every day, crying every day. Like some days they're just perfectly fine. And then something happens, they smell something, they see something, something triggers an emotion that reminds them of their loved one. And then here comes grief. And so for those who are grieving, I wanted them to see that it's okay to grieve and that you should just ride the wave when it comes. Like he's been gone almost 3 years and I still have moments of grief, you know, and I just ride the wave, like just let it happen. So defining moments, it details my grief journey, starting with the death of my fiance, but I also had 4 other deaths in 1 year. So my fiance died, then one of my closest sister friends, she got murdered, then my dad died, and then my father-in-law died, which was my fiance's dad, and then one of my brother's best friend, who was like another brother to me, he committed suicide, all in 1 year. So I wanted to show that multiple griefs is, you know, multiple deaths and grieving multiple people can be hard, but it can be done. And so in the book, I detailed some of the steps or some of the ways that I've been able to get on the other side of grief. And so one of the chapters I focus on support. And I learned a funny lesson about support. I learned that support is a two-way street, right? I learned that support requires you to actually tell people what you need, but then it also requires you to be open to receiving what you say you need. And how I learned that lesson was while I was grieving, I was isolating myself. But yet at the same time, I was getting frustrated with the people in my life because I'm like, they should just know. Why aren't they calling? Why aren't they checking on me? Why? And I remember praying, I'm like, God, I'm over here grieving by myself. And God was like, because you're not letting people in. You're not letting people in. And I'm like, I am letting people in. And then one of my best friends, she calls me and she just has a real heart to heart. And she's like, I'm trying to be there for you, but you keep pushing me away. And I learned then that if I want support, then I have to be willing to tell people what that support is and how it looks for me. But then I also have to be open to receiving it. So one of the ways that I talk about in the chapter that I helped my friends be able to help me was we came up with a code word. And so anytime I text them that code word, they knew I was having a grief moment. I needed just a listening ear, or just call me or something. And so I showed in that chapter that sometimes support is not always a conversation. Sometimes support is, hey, I'm just going to show up and sit on your bed today and be quiet. You know, sometimes I'll send you some food. Sometimes support is, because the reality is when you've lost a loved one, what people miss out in grief is that, okay, the primary loss is that my loved one is gone. The secondary loss is now I have to figure out this thing called life without my loved one. So for a spouse or a fiance, that is, okay, we just went from one income, like 2 incomes to one. That is, what does even life look like? I still got to pay the bills. If I have children, the children still got to have normal lives. So you have all these other parts of your loss that you now have to figure out. And that's why grief can be so complex.
I love it. I don't know if you know, but I talk so much about grief. My next book's about grief, and it's so true what you've been saying. So I think I say about communication in my book,
Yeah.
and it's what you're saying, that people say like, oh, you know, they're in a better place. And you think, well, I don't care really, because I want them here, you know. And not everyone believes they're in a better place because they don't believe in an afterlife. You know, I know you have great faith with yourself, and I do as well. And I think that's what happens, isn't it, around communication and support, that people don't know what to say. And I personally, it's what I say in the next book, personally, I'd rather someone had a good old try, even if they said the wrong thing, because at least that means they're there with me.
Yeah.
So even if they say something absolutely ridiculous, like, oh, well, don't worry, tomorrow's Thursday, or they're in a better place, or things happen for a reason, I think, well, at least you're showing up, at least you're trying.
Yeah.
Rather than the people that I've had that have physically crossed the road, I'm thinking, I can see you, you know, grief, you know, doesn't cause blindness as far as I know from 30 years in healthcare. And people are like physically crossing the road, as in like, oh my God, she's going to sob on me. You know, we're awfully English here, Leah. We don't like to sob, you know. But it's important, isn't it? That we do, try and communicate with these people, because you feel different. You don't want people treating you differently. You want some kind of normalcy in it all, don't you?
Yeah. Yeah. And that was one of the many lessons I tell. And the other thing I learned was sometimes you got to be to other people what you need. And that was hard because, maybe 4 or 5 months after he had passed, I finally went back to work, and I work in mental health. So imagine showing up every day and I got to help everybody else through their issues. And it was weird because at the time, a lot of my clients was dealing with grief. So here I am grieving. They're not aware that I'm grieving, but now I have to be what I need to them. And just showing up every day and encouraging them. But at the same time, while I was, planting seeds of encouragement, then it would come back to me in the moments that I needed it. And so I had to learn that sometimes you have to be to others in your time of need and despair what you need. And it's the weirdest thing. It was like one of the lessons that I was like, really? Like, why I gotta learn this lesson? But I understand it now that sometimes you do. And it helps you to kind of take your mind off of you for a moment and put it on somebody else who might even be in a worse place, than you are.
I can understand that, because I think if you didn't have that role to play, if you didn't have that purpose in someone else's grief, you might not address it in your own life.
Yeah.
Or you might just sit there in a state of inertia and not move forward. And actually, when you have to get up, we say like loss of income as well as loss of a loved one,
Mm-hmm.
you still have to show up. And I think it's probably really painful, but us could be healing,
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to still show up when you're still trying to figure out the pieces of your life. But I found that there was some healing in that, and I think the biggest lesson I learned in that is that pain has a purpose, and in the moment, you don't see it. I tell people, if you would have told me 3 years ago that I'd be where I am today, I probably would have laughed at you and said you're lying, because in the moment when the death happens and the pain is so intense and it's so real, you could barely get out of bed. Or you don't even want to, like, you don't want to face the world, you know. But there's a moment where you realize that, and I'll say what my therapist said to me. She literally said, Leah, you cannot die with him. Because there was a moment in my journey where it was just like, well, take me too, Lord, because I can't see my life without this person. I can't see my life, not being a wife and all these things. And I think the biggest aha moment was realizing that just because the picture you created for yourself did not manifest like you wanted it, doesn't mean that the picture won't manifest. It's just, it's going to show up in a different way at a different time. So even though for me, it was, I'm supposed to be a wife, I had to realize that doesn't mean it won't happen. It just will happen in its own time, when it's supposed to happen, with who it's supposed to happen with. The picture doesn't change. It just might take a little longer for it to manifest.
I'm trying to think of words.
That's like the second time.
Yeah, I know. I'm just like, things happen in threes. I can only imagine where the next part of the show is going to go. So, yeah, I've been in healthcare for 30 years, been in life for nearly 50 years. And what you're saying is exactly why I work with grief and things like that. Because when I was nursing and like their loved one died, my patient died, I would see that person, a little bit of them died really, and their way of life died. And so why I set up like a death cafe here, why I wrote my grief book, is because of what you said really, because we can't allow ourselves to die with them. And it's just really poignant, and it hurts. I mean, you had so many losses in such a short space of time. You've probably had more losses in 1 year than people experience in their lifetime.
Yeah.
And you're still here telling the story and carrying on. And I love it, because what I used to get quite a lot with the younger ones in cancer would be like, they wouldn't know how to carry on. There's like, they were my other half. And I didn't have the courage that I have now to say, well, actually you was whole before you met them, so you will be whole again. Because, if my husband died, I would be absolutely crap and probably wouldn't even read my own book. But it's just amazing to hear it from someone else, the positivity, the like collateral beauty within grief, where there's a lesson in it. And the fact that your therapist said, like, you know, you can't allow yourself to die with them,
Yeah.
it's just so powerful. And I
Yeah.
love the manifestation. Like, so you was going to, you know, you were engaged to be married, but that doesn't mean that you won't be married. And I just don't know if I know anyone braver than you, Leah, if I'm honest.
But it honestly, Shelley, it's been a process though. You know, it's been a process. I didn't get to these revelations overnight. You know, it took doing the work, you know, going to therapy, having those moments of processing, and realizing that I'm not honoring my loved ones if I just give up on life. You know, I'm not honoring, you know, the 2 years that I spent with my fiance before he died and the love we shared if I just give up. I'm not honoring my dad if I just give up. And so, what better way to honor who they were in my life than to continue on this journey and continue to be the best version of myself and to continue to do the things that make me happy? That's honoring them, you know, not just wallowing in my grief. I remember hearing, I think the other aha moment for me was I heard, and I was listening to a TED talk about grief. And the lady said that grieving is not about moving on, it's about moving forward. And that struck me like a lightning. I was like, oh my God, aha, yes. Because I think the narrative has always been, oh, you have to move on. I
Yeah.
don't have to move on. I have to move forward though. And know that when you're moving forward with your loved ones right there with you. They might not be physically right there, but they are around you. They let you know. Like I'll share a story when I was getting ready to release my podcast. It was the funniest thing because I felt Joseph, that was my fiance's name, like I felt his presence around me. And I just laughed and I was like, thank you for letting me know you're here, because I could just feel his presence. But it was a gentle reminder that I'm here. I might not physically be here, but I'm here and I'm watching you and I'm cheering for you and I'm excited for you. I'm just not physically here to do it. And so learning that it wasn't about, oh, I need to move on. It was about moving forward and knowing that their spirit is right there with you as you move forward.
I love that. I was just thinking I might go for a rebrand because I'm Shelley F. Knight, life goes on, but which is what my beautiful stepdad used to say. He died like 16 years ago, and he used to, whatever went on, no matter how much proverbial poo hit the fan, he would always say, like, life goes on.
Yeah.
And used to be, you know, relationship breakdown, job loss, you know, life goes on. And so that's why it's the words I use. But I think life goes forward.
Yeah.
It's a gentleness about it, isn't there?
It is. And I think it takes away the pressure, because I know as experiencing grief, people will try to timestamp your grief. So after a certain time, they're like, "Oh, you shouldn't be crying about it over it anymore. You shouldn't be this anymore." And it's like there's no timestamp to grief. You know, there's no. I was having It's funny because I had a conversation with my grandmother when I was home in New York for Christmas, and I said to her, I said, "Grandma, how long did it take you?" Because my aunt's dad was her first love, and he had passed away. And I said, "Well, how long did it take you to like know that you were ready for another relationship after him?" And she said 12 years. And I just looked in like shock, like 12 years. That's a long, here I am, year 3, and you said 12 years. And I said, "Well, why do you think that is, Grandma?" And she said, "There's just no time stamp to grief." She said, "You got to go through it. You got to, go through the process." And after 12 years, I was like, you know what? I think I'm ready to, try this thing again and put myself back out there. But then, you hear the stories of people after 2 years. So I even in my book, there's no time stamp. If after 2 years you feel like you're okay and you can do this thing, cool. If it takes you 15, cool. Only you're going to know when you are ready to take the next leap, whether that's another relationship or whether only you will know. And it's going to be when you're ready and not when the world says you should be ready.
Yeah, and I think that's key, isn't it? I know, sort of statistically speaking, like men tend to move on and remarry within 18 months, where women nearer 7 years. But, you know, for those people that find love with the best friends straight away, it's okay, isn't it? I know it's hard as an onlooker, but you're not living in it. Do you know what I mean? And sometimes it
Yeah.
comes down to companionship, doesn't it? Being heard. Maybe it's destiny, who knows? But as you say, there's no time stamp, and we just need to go with our grief, whether it's finding the next person or how long we're going to cry for. And I think
Yeah.
that's really valuable.
Yeah.
Leah, I've absolutely loved speaking to you. You are the most beautiful soul.
Thank you.
Just absolutely amazing. My husband's going to want me, well, he also want to be more like you, really, to have more quiet moments, like when I was left speechless. He's probably going to try and be more Leah so he can have some silence in life. But just the most beautiful soul. I mean, you have been through so much in your life, like truly, you know, from like your upbringing, all the death you've had in your life and things like that. And you're just there going like, well, you know, I'm just moving forward. And as you said, it didn't happen overnight. But the beautiful lessons you've shared are just like eternally grateful. So thank you.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it.
If you enjoyed today's episode, please ensure you subscribe and do leave a positive review. If you would like to create your own positive changes, head on over to shelleyfknight.com and you can buy yourself a copy of Positive Changes, a self-cookbook. If you want some positivity until the next show, come join us over on Facebook. That's Shelley F. Knight, Life Goes On. So I've been Shelley F. Knight, and as always, you've been amazing.